Add underscore. Do it again, human. Love me again, human, said the alien. The sky above the small coastal town had turned an unusual shade of purple that evening. Most people didn't notice because they were busy with their daily routines, coming home from work, cooking dinner, checking their phones. But David noticed. He always noticed things like that. He was a fisherman who spent more time looking at the sky than most people, trying to predict weather patterns and the best times to head out to sea. That purple sky should have been his first warning that something strange was about to happen. He was walking along the beach, his boots leaving deep prints in the wet sand when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just a piece of driftwood, or maybe some trash washed up by the tide. But as he got closer, he realized it was moving. The thing was about the size of a large dog, with skin that looked almost translucent, like you could see right through it to something glowing underneath. It had what looked like arms and legs, but they were longer than they should be, and it moved in a way that made David's stomach turn. The creature was hurt. He could see that right away. There was a dark liquid seeping from a wound on its side, and it was making soft sounds that reminded him of wind chimes mixed with a cat's purr. David wasn't the kind of person who could just walk away from something in pain, even if that something looked like it came from another planet. He approached slowly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. The creature's eyes, which were too large and completely black, focused on him. It tried to move away but collapsed back onto the sand bay. David could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was real. This was actually happening. There was an alien creature right in front of him, bleeding on his beach. Without thinking too much about it, David took off his jacket and carefully wrapped it around the creature. It didn't resist. Up close, he could see that its skin changed colors slightly, like oil on water, and it was warm to the touch. But he lifted it as gently as he could. It was lighter than he expected, almost like it was hollow inside. Getting it back to his house was the easy part. David lived alone in a small cottage just off the beach, a stair about a mile away. The hard part was figuring out what to do next. He couldn't exactly call emergency services. What would he even say? He laid the creature on his couch and started looking at the wound. It was deep and seemed to be getting worse. David had some first aid supplies from his fishing trips. He'd patched himself up plenty of times over the years. He cleaned the wound as best he could, though he had no idea if human medicine would work on whatever this thing was. The creature watched him the whole time with those impossibly black eyes, making those chiming, purring sounds. It took him 3 days to nurse the creature back to health. 3 days of barely sleeping, of trying different foods to see what it would eat, which turned out to be mostly fruits and raw fish. 3 days of wondering if he was losing his mind or if this was really happening. The creature started moving around on the second day, exploring his small house with curiosity. It touched everything, running those long fingers over his furniture, his books, his fishing equipment. On the third evening, something incredible happened. David was sitting on the floor, exhausted, when the creature came and sat next to him. It reached out one of those strange hands and touched David's face. The moment they made contact, David felt something flood into his mind. Not words exactly, but meanings. Feelings. The creature was trying to communicate. He learned that it had crashed here by accident. But its ship had malfunctioned somewhere above the ocean, and it had barely managed to get to shore before losing consciousness. It was alone, far from its home, and in that moment, David felt a connection to it. He knew what it was like to feel isolated and different. That night, David did something he would later struggle to explain. He held the creature close, and they fell asleep together on the couch. There was nothing weird about it, nothing wrong. It was just two lonely beings finding comfort in each other's presence. When morning came, the creature seemed stronger, its wound almost completely healed. But more than that, something had changed between them. The creature started following David everywhere. When he went to the kitchen, it came along. When he walked on the beach, it walked beside him, though he made sure to go at times when no one else would be around. It learned quickly, mimicking his actions, trying to understand his world. And David found himself talking to it constantly, even though he knew it couldn't understand his words. Or could it? By the end of the first week, David realized something that made his chest feel tight. He cared about this creature. He actually cared about it in a way he hadn't cared about anything in years. He'd been alone for so long, keeping everyone at arm's length. But this strange being from the stars had somehow gotten past all his defenses. The days turned into weeks, and David's life had completely changed. Every morning started the same way now. He'd wake up to find the creature sitting by the window, watching the sunrise with those deep black eyes. It would turn when it heard him stir, and those chiming sounds it made would fill the room. David had started to understand what different sounds meant. This morning's sound was happiness. It was saying hello in its own way. Teaching the creature about Earth became David's favorite thing. He showed it how to cook, though it preferred its fish raw. He taught it how to play cards, and it picked up the rules faster than any human he'd ever met. They watched movies together, and the creature seemed fascinated by the emotions on screen, tilting its head and making questioning sounds whenever characters hugged or kissed. The hardest part was keeping it secret. David's sister called every Sunday, and he had to make excuses for why she couldn't visit. His fishing buddies wondered why he'd stopped going to the local bar. He told them he was working on fixing up the house, that he needed time alone. They believed him because David had always been a bit of a loner anyway, but secrets have a way of becoming heavy. One afternoon, while David was in town buying groceries, his neighbor Tom stopped by unannounced. David came home to find Tom's truck in his driveway and nearly had a heart attack. He rushed inside, preparing for the worst, but found Tom sitting on the porch, looking confused. The creature had hidden somewhere. David could feel it nearby, scared. Tom said he'd knocked, but nobody answered, so he was just leaving a note about borrowing some tools. David tried to act normal, but his hands were shaking as he unlocked the door. As soon as Tom left, the creature emerged from beneath the porch, covered in sand and making distressed sounds. David held it close, telling it everything was okay, that it was safe. And that's when he realized something that changed everything. He wasn't just caring for this creature anymore. He loved it. Not in any strange way that people might misunderstand, but in the way you love family. The way you love someone who understands you completely without needing words. That night they sat on the beach together under the stars. The creature pointed up at the sky, at a spot that didn't look special to David. It made a long, low sound that felt like sadness. Its home was up there somewhere, and possibly far away. David felt his throat tighten. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but he'd been pushing it away, pretending they could just keep living like this forever. The creature turned to him and placed its hand on his chest, right over his heart. Then it touched its own chest. David understood. It felt the connection too, but it needed to go home. It had a family up there, a life it had left behind. The crash hadn't been planned. It was never supposed to stay here. They started working on a signal. The creature drew diagrams in the sand, showing David what it needed. It required specific metals, a power source, and a way to amplify the signal strong enough to reach its people. Breaths. David had no idea if they could actually build such a thing, but he had to try. He couldn't keep the creature trapped on Earth just because he was afraid of being alone again. He started making trips to junkyards and electronic stores, buying parts without really understanding what they were for. The creature would examine each piece, making approving or disapproving sounds. Slowly, a device started taking shape in David's garage. It looked like nothing he'd ever seen, a combination of Earth technology and something far more advanced. During this time, David noticed the creature was teaching him things too. It showed him how to see patterns in nature he'd never noticed before. How the waves moved in mathematical sequences. How the stars weren't just random points of light but part of vast networks. His view of the universe was expanding, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, while they were working on the device, the creature did something new. It picked up a pencil and paper, and it drew. Not diagrams this time, but a picture of David. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were a bit off. But it was clearly him. The creature pointed to the picture, then to David, then placed its hand over its own heart again. David felt tears in his eyes. Pete spent so much of his life pushing people away, convinced that he was better off alone. But this being from another world had shown him what he'd been missing. Connection. Understanding. Love in its purest form, uncomplicated by human expectations and fears. They finished the device 3 weeks after Tom's surprise visit. It hummed with an energy that made David's teeth ache. The creature activated it, and a beam of light shot up into the night sky. Then they waited. The creature explained through gestures and feelings that it might take days or even weeks for its people to receive the signal and respond. Those waiting days were bittersweet. David and the creature spent every moment together, doing simple things. Beth. Walking on the beach, sharing meals, sitting in comfortable silence. The creature had learned to smile, sort of, a stretching of its features that shouldn't have looked friendly but somehow did. And David found himself smiling more than he had in years. The response came on a Tuesday morning. David was making breakfast when the device in the garage suddenly blazed with light. The creature rushed to it, making excited sounds that filled the house. Breaths. David followed, his stomach dropping. This was it. They were coming to take it home. The creature manipulated the device, and somehow, impossibly, images formed in the air above it. Holographic projections showing other beings like it, showing a ship, showing a location in the mountains, about 200 miles away. That's where they would meet. In 3 days, the creature would be going home. David should have been happy. This was what they'd been working toward. But instead, he felt like his heart was being squeezed in a vice. He nodded, forcing a smile, and the creature touched his face gently. It knew. It understood what he was feeling because it was feeling it too. They spent those 3 days preparing for the journey. David loaded supplies into his old truck, mapping out the route to the mountains. He told his sister he was going on a fishing trip, told his buddies he needed to clear his head. Nobody questioned it. Nobody knew what he was really about to do. The drive took almost 5 hours. The creature sat in the passenger seat, hidden under a blanket whenever they passed other vehicles. It kept one hand on David's arm the whole time, a constant presence, a reminder that this was real. They listened to music on the radio, and the creature had learned which songs David liked, making happy sounds when they came on. The meeting point was a clearing high up in the mountains, far from any roads or hiking trails. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The creature stood in the center of the clearing, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear. David stayed back, giving it space, feeling more alone than he had in months. That night, they made a fire. David had brought food, and they shared what would be their last meal together. The creature had gotten better at eating cooked food, though it still made faces at some of the flavors. They laughed about that. The creature had learned to understand laughter, even if it couldn't quite do it itself. As the fire burned low, the creature moved closer to David. It reached out and took his hand, and suddenly David felt a rush of images and emotions flooding his mind. He saw the creature's home world, a place of impossible beauty with purple skies and silver oceans. He saw its family, beings like it gathered together in structures that seemed to be made of living crystal. He felt its fear when the ship had crashed, its pain and loneliness, and then the moment it first saw David on the beach. He felt the creature's love for him, pure and overwhelming. It wasn't romantic, wasn't the kind of love that humans usually talked about. But it was deep and real. It was the love of someone who had been saved, who had found kindness in a strange and frightening place. It was the love of a friend, a family, of something even beyond that. David sent his own feelings back through that connection, his loneliness before they met, his fear of letting anyone close, and then the joy he'd found in their friendship, the way the creature had changed his life completely. He shared his gratitude and his sorrow, all mixed together until he couldn't tell where one feeling ended and another began. They stayed like that for hours, holding hands by the fire, sharing everything they couldn't put into words. When the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they both knew the moment was close. The ship appeared silently, a massive structure that seemed to fold space around itself. It hovered above the clearing, beautiful and terrifying. David had known intellectually that the creature came from a civilization far more advanced than Earth's, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. It made him feel small and insignificant, but also grateful that he'd been given this experience. A beam of light descended from the ship, and 3 more beings emerged. They looked similar to David's friend, but were taller, with different colorings in their translucent skin. They approached cautiously, and David could feel their surprise when they saw him standing next to the creature. His friend communicated with them in ways David couldn't follow. Fast exchanges of light and sound. The tallest of the 3 came forward and touched David's face, the same way his friend had that first night. David felt a probe in his mind. Gentle, but thorough. It was examining him, understanding what had happened, seeing the bond between him and the creature. When it pulled away, it made a sound that felt like approval. His friend turned to David then, and he knew it was time to say goodbye. They looked at each other for a long moment. David wanted to ask it to stay, wanted to beg it not to leave him alone again, but he couldn't do that. He loved the creature too much to trap it here, when it had a whole life waiting up there among the stars. The creature stepped forward and wrapped its arms around David. It was the first time they'd hugged like this, a full embrace. David held on tight, memorizing the feel of it, the warmth, the strange texture of its skin, the chiming sounds it was making softly. Sounds that meant goodbye, that meant thank you, that meant I'll never forget you. When the creature released him and turned toward the light, David felt something break inside his chest. He watched as it walked toward the beam, watched as the light began to lift it up toward the ship. At the last second, it turned back and raised one hand. David raised his own hand in return, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Then it was gone, pulled up into the ship. The other beings followed. The light disappeared, and the ship began to rise. David stood in that clearing, alone, watching as the impossible craft climbed higher and higher until it was just another point of light among the stars. Then even that was gone. The drive back home was the longest of David's life. The truck felt too empty, too quiet. He kept looking over at the passenger seat, expecting to see the creature there, expecting to hear those chiming sounds. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the engine and his own breathing. When he got home, everything reminded him of what he'd lost. The couch where they'd slept that first night. The kitchen where he'd taught it to cook. The beach where they'd walked every evening. His house felt hollow, like the life had been sucked out of it. David tried to go back to his normal routine. He went out fishing, but his heart wasn't in it. He met up with his buddies at the bar, but their conversations felt meaningless. His sister came to visit, and he had to pretend everything was fine, that he hadn't just said goodbye to the most important relationship of his life. Weeks passed, then months. David went through the motions of living, but part of him felt dead inside. He'd been alone before the creature came, but this was different. Before, he'd been alone because he chose to be. Now he was alone because the one being who truly understood him was gone, somewhere among the stars where he could never reach. He thought about the creature constantly. Was it happy to be home? Bess. Had it told its family about the human who had saved it? Did it miss him the way he missed it? Bears. Sometimes, late at night, David would stand on the beach and look up at the stars, wondering which one was its home, feeling the distance between them like a physical ache. People in town noticed the change in him. Bears. David had always been quiet, but now he was withdrawn in a way that worried them. His sister tried to get him to talk, but what could he say? But that he'd fallen in love with an alien, and now that it was gone, he didn't know how to be okay again? They'd think he was crazy. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe the whole thing had been some kind of breakdown, and he'd imagined it all. But no, there was proof. The device in his garage, made of parts that no human could have assembled. The strange marks on his floor where the creature had moved furniture. The drawings it had made, still tucked away in his desk drawer. But 6 months after the creature left, David stopped going to the beach. It hurt too much, remembering all the evenings they'd spent there together. He threw himself into work instead, taking his boat out for longer and longer trips, exhausting himself so completely that he'd fall into bed without time to think or remember. His buddies staged an intervention of sorts, showing up at his house one evening with beer and concern. They told him they were worried, that he'd changed, that he seemed lost. David appreciated their concern, but how could he explain? How could he tell them that he'd experienced something so profound, so life-changing, that everything else felt like shadows now? That night, after they left, David went to his garage. Peace. He stood in front of the device they'd built together, this impossible piece of technology that was the only proof his friend had been real. He reached out and touched it, and for just a moment, he thought he felt something. Warmth. A presence. But then it was gone, and he was alone again. He almost destroyed it that night. Almost took a hammer to the whole thing, wanting to erase the evidence, wanting to forget. But he couldn't do it. It was all he had left. The next morning, David woke up to something strange. The device in his garage was glowing, not the bright light it had made when calling the ship, but a soft, steady pulse. He rushed to it, his heart pounding, hardly daring to hope. And then he felt it, a touch in his mind, gentle and familiar. The creature was reaching out to him across the impossible distance between their worlds. It wasn't a clear communication, more like an emotion, a feeling. The creature was saying, "Hello?" It was saying, "I remember you." It was saying, "I miss you too, Bay." David sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The creature had found a way to stay connected. Somehow, using technology he couldn't begin to understand, it had created a link between them. It was faint, barely there, but it was real. Every day after that, David would go to the garage and touch the device. Bay. And every day he would feel that connection, that presence in his mind. The creature would share pieces of its life with him, images of its homeworld, feelings of being reunited with its family. But also, always, that underlying current of affection, of remembering their time together. It wasn't the same as having the creature there in person. David still felt the loss, still missed the physical presence, the chiming sounds, the way it would touch his face. But it was something. It was a promise that their friendship hadn't ended. That distance couldn't erase what they'd shared. A year had passed since the creature left, and David had learned to live with the ache of its absence. The daily connection through the device had become his lifeline, the thing that got him out of bed each morning. He'd started fishing again, really fishing, not just going through the motions, for he'd reconnected with his friends and family, let his sister visit more often. Life wasn't the same as it had been with the creature, but it was better than those dark months right after it left. Spring came to the coastal town, bringing warmer weather and clearer skies. David was on the beach one evening, just walking and thinking, when the device in his garage sent a pulse through his mind so strong it made him gasp. This was different from the daily touches. This was urgent, insistent, calling him home. He ran. He didn't care that people saw him sprinting down the beach like a madman. He just ran, his lungs burning, his heart racing. When he burst into his garage, the device was blazing with light, brighter than it had ever been. Images were forming in the air. And what David saw made his breath catch. The creature was coming back. It was on a ship heading toward Earth, but something was wrong. The images showed damage, showed the ship struggling. There had been an accident, some kind of system failure. The creature was hurt, and it was coming to the only place in the universe it knew it would be safe. It was coming back to him. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed supplies, loaded them into his truck, and headed for the same mountain clearing where they'd said goodbye. The device had shown him that's where the ship would land. As he drove through the night, he felt the creature's presence in his mind more strongly than ever, sending waves of pain and fear, but also hope. It was holding on because it knew David would be there. The sun was just rising when he reached the clearing. The sky was clear and beautiful, completely unlike that purple evening over a year ago when everything had started. David stood in the center of the clearing, watching the sky, waiting. He saw the ship before he heard it. It was smaller than the one that had taken the creature away, maybe a personal vessel, and it was moving erratically, base, Smoke or steam trailed behind it. David's heart clenched as he watched it descend. Too fast, hitting the ground with a terrible crash that shook the earth beneath his feet. He ran toward it without thinking about danger, without thinking about anything except getting to the creature. A hatch opened, and there it was, crawling out, clearly hurt. Its skin had lost some of its glow, and it was making sounds David had never heard before, sounds of pain. David reached it and gathered it into his arms, and this time he didn't care about the tears streaming down his face. The creature wrapped itself around him, holding on like it would never let go. Through their connection, David felt everything. The creature had been injured in an accident on its home world. As it recovered, it had realized something that changed everything. It didn't belong there anymore. Its heart, if it had a heart, was here, on Earth with David. But there was more. Through the connection, the creature was asking him something, showing him images of its world, of a life there together. It was asking if David would consider coming with it. Not now, not while it was hurt, but eventually. When it healed, when it was strong enough to make the journey again. It was asking if David would leave Earth behind and start a new life among the stars. David pulled back just enough to look into those deep black eyes. A year ago, he would have said no without thinking. Earth was his home, always had been. But now, after all this time of feeling half alive, of missing the creature every single moment, the answer was clear. Yes, yes. He would go. Earth would always be his birthplace, but home was wherever the creature was. The creature made that chiming sound that David now knew meant joy. It touched his face, and David felt a rush of happiness so pure it almost hurt. It would have time to help the creature heal, time for David to prepare, to say proper goodbyes to his family and friends, to put his life in order, but eventually they would leave together. Over the next few months, David helped the creature recover just as he had that first time. But now, it was different, because they both knew this wasn't temporary. They were building towards something permanent, something that would last. David told his sister everything. Breath. She didn't believe him at first, thought maybe he'd had some kind of breakdown. But then he brought her to meet the creature. And seeing was believing. She cried, not because she was scared, but because she'd never seen David so happy. She made him promise to stay in touch somehow, and the creature assured them both that communication between worlds was possible. When the day finally came for them to leave, David stood in his house one last time. He'd sold most of his things, given away what he couldn't sell. All that remained were a few precious items, memories of his life on Earth. He tucked a photo of his sister and her kids into his pocket. Those memories would come with him. The new ship descended into the clearing, beautiful and whole. The creature took David's hand, and together they walked toward it. At the entrance, David paused and looked back at the earth, at the sky, at the mountains and trees. This planet had been his whole world for so many years. But now he had a bigger world waiting. Not just a world, but entire galaxies to explore, with his best friend by his side. The creature squeezed his hand, and through their connection, David felt its love and excitement. They stepped into the ship together. As they lifted off, David watched through a viewing screen as Earth grew smaller and smaller below them. He felt a pang of sadness, a moment of wondering if he was making a huge mistake. But then the creature moved close to him, radiating warmth and affection, and David knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Sometimes love doesn't look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it comes from the stars in a form we never imagined. Sometimes it means leaving everything we know behind for the unknown. But when it's real, when it's true, none of that matters. The creature leaned against David as they traveled through space, and he wrapped his arm around it. Ahead of them lay adventures he couldn't even imagine, a new life in a new world. Behind them was Earth, his home, growing ever more distant. But David wasn't sad anymore. Psst. He was ready. Ready for whatever came next, as long as they faced it together.